So let's consider the case of KSR versus Teleflex. Flex. And these are two companies that battled each other in a court that was then reversed by another court, which was then reversed by another court. And the courts kept reversing each other. And as a result, one can make the claim that if these august bodies are not able to make a decision, then obviously the decision about what is obvious is not obvious. Right? Eventually this went to the Supreme Court, and then it became the law of the land. And the Supreme Court's interpretations are often cited as reasons for doing certain things. They set a precedent. So let's start by describing the situation. KSR, a company based in Canada, had a patent on a pedal system, and they had introduced it to GM, which makes cars in Canada as well as in other countries. GM is an international company. I think they make cars in China now too. And so they make cars in Michigan and in Mexico and in Canada. They make cars everywhere. They're so huge. So then they had this interesting adjustable pedal system for the throttle using cables. And they decided that it was time to create something a little bit more like a acceleration by wire system. So they came up with a modular sensor system for the throttle cable, and they wanted to make it compatible with the GM trucks. They had a competitor called Teleflex. Teleflex also makes pedals, and it had a license for a patent, which essentially allowed it to claim that one of the claims in the prior KSR patent was an infringement. And so they sued based on this claim. There are a couple of reasons why you can sue. One is if something is obvious. And for obviousness, there's an acid test, which is one of many tests. And this test, which is considered valid, is called the TSM test, which is for teaching or suggesting or some motivation that may be found in prior art. So if you can combine these different sorts of teachings in prior arts, or if you can find compelling motivations in prior art, or if you can find the suggestions in prior art, you don't have to do it and, it can be or, then that is sufficient to claim obviousness. It's an acid test, and the Supreme Court says the test, the TSM test, teaching, suggestion, motivation test, is one of a number of valid rationales for justifying obviousness. But it's certainly not the only rationale. Teaching, suggestion, motivation in prior art. Another rationale is called the Graham test. This is called factual queries. This one says if there are people who are ordinary and skilled in the art and they say this is not obvious, that is a factual query. So you can get the experts up in the court and do a query and say, geez, did you think that was obvious? No, I don't think it's obvious. And so the Graham test can also become an acid test. So what may seem obvious to you, because you're so expert, might not seem obvious to a number of other experts, and therefore if they say it's not obvious, then it isn't obvious, and that's called a finding of fact. And so you get all of these experts in there to say, you know, I'm an expert and I never would have thought of that. That wasn't obvious. So figuring out the difference between prior claims and the claims that you've got, figuring out, like for example, you might have a patent on some idea, but maybe the prior idea had already been patented, but maybe they never really taught you how to implement the idea. So now maybe your patent needs to be adjusted to explicitly describe how that idea can be done. For example, there was one person who had an idea. He runs a company called InventRight, and it was for rotating labels. And he never found any idea exactly on how you would apply the labels. So his contribution was exactly how you would implement the label application system as opposed to the rotating labels. He had shown it to Procter & Gamble, and Procter & Gamble said, we won't pay you a dime because that's already been done. People already know how to apply rotating labels. And then he said, yeah, but they never They never told you how it was to be implemented, and apparently how wasn't obvious. So there are different ways in which you can react to these things. One thing that I thought was really interesting is this timeline. When we looked at Teleflex, they sue KSR for violation of Claim 4, and then KSR turns around and countersues and says, Claim 4 is obvious, so you can't sue us for something that's obvious. The district court rules in favor of KSR, which says KSR says the claim is obvious, and therefore will sustain the obviousness. Then the federal court overrules the district court in favor of Teleflex, and then Teleflex says, yeah, it's a violation of Claim 4, and it's not obvious. Then the Supreme Court comes in, and the Supreme Court overrides the federal court based on Graham's analysis, which says we're going to do finding of fact, and then now all of a sudden it really was obvious. So who was right? And if these guys can't agree, like we're talking about district courts versus federal courts versus Supreme Courts, these are all like professional magistrates. They're professional intellectual property magistrates. They know this field, and they can't agree. So how are we, mere peons, supposed to make a decision? And this is a tough problem, right? These guys can't agree. How are we supposed to know? So this is one of those things, you look at the details and you say, look, it's an adjustable pedal with a module. So there's a control system, there's a pedal assembly, there's prior patents which describe control systems and pedal assemblies. This one has a fewer, less parts. It looks like it's easier to package. Is it obvious or isn't it obvious? It's a gas pedal. I wouldn't even think of getting a patent on a gas pedal. To me, it's totally obvious. I'm the computer guy. What do I know from cars? But I look at this and I say, yep, that's obvious. No question, it's a gas pedal. You want to patent the gas pedal? It's like you might as well patent the sun. Really. So I don't see how this can be making any kind of material contribution to the world's knowledge. If you came to me with a master's thesis on this gas pedal, I'd say, where's your contribution? You could say, look, it's a pedal, and you press on it, and it makes the thing go. And I'd say, sorry, I don't get it. To me, this does not look like a contribution to anything. That's my opinion. But I'm not a Supreme Court justice, and I don't serve on the district court, and I'm not in the federal court, and I'm not even a lawyer. I'm just some guy who looks at a gas pedal and says, so what? Maybe you are having this reaction too. So we zoom in on the gas pedal, because maybe there's something here we're not seeing, which is likely, right? Because these guys are arguing. There must be something here. So I look at the gas pedal and I think to myself, there's something going on here. I don't quite... What is this part 70? What's that little thing, that doodad they call part 24? And it looks like the pedal can go in or out. And I'm looking at this thing. It's a pedal arm. It goes in two directions. Electronic throttle control signals correspond to pedal arm positions as a pedal arm pivots about the axis between the rest and applied positions. In my opinion, they're making a mountain out of a molehill. It's a pedal. It goes in and it comes out. As far as I'm concerned, it has all the novelty of a light switch. Light goes on, light goes off. Right? What is there something novel here? You tell me. Let me not just inject my opinion. I'm asking you. What? Maybe I'm missing it. Does anybody here see anything novel about this invention? Is it the throttle? Throttles are not novel. Throttles are not new. Is it the pedal? Pedals are not novel. Right? We've had gas pedals, right? Since like the 1900s, early 1900s, people had cars with gas pedals and everything, and they went. And they even had brakes too. In fact, maybe the brakes were as important as the gas pedals. How about this other thing, the electronic throttle control? which corresponds to pedal arm position as pedal arm pivots. Is that the contribution, the throttle that's electronic? What part of all of this is considered novel? The fact that there's a pedal is not new. The fact that there's a throttle can't be new. The electronic control signal. So it's some sort of a sensor, really. It's not even controlling the pedal. It doesn't give you gas acceleration authority. It's just sensing how much you've depressed the pedal, right? That's it. So it's a sensor. So the invention has to be non-obvious in order to allow the claim. In addition to being novel, the test for non-obviousness, we use the TSM test, we use the Graham test. We figure out what a lay person, let's say a person in the field, might have considered. Ordinary skill in the art. This is called USC Code 35, subsection 103A. A person ordinarily skilled in the art might not have come up with this on their own. And if a technician would have done this, then maybe you shouldn't have gotten a patent on it. Of course, I think that is very demeaning to technicians. I see nothing wrong with technicians getting patents. So I don't feel like that's a valid statement at all. As a matter of fact, if you told me this person who thought of it didn't have a high school degree, it wouldn't bother me. Right? So what if they're a technician? Their ability to invent is as good as mine. They can be even better, maybe, because they're not unencumbered by all this prior knowledge. They can just think free. So I've got this idea that maybe just because they're a technician, that should not be in any kind of, the sense of the word, an acid test. I cite, for example, Thomas Edison, who has more patents than anyone ever in history, who never graduated from high school. So this idea that technicians should not be allowed to have patents makes no sense to me at all. What about this idea about the Court of Appeals? They're going to use this thing called the TSM doctrine for non-obviousness. Teaching, suggestion, motivation, the litmus test, the acid test. Is everybody familiar with the term the litmus test? You know what that's like, what you test for pH or base, right? You take purple cabbage, you boil it in water, that makes phenols in solution, then you can take a cup of it, add a little vinegar, it changes color. That's a litmus test. Chemistry in the kitchen. Great fun. You'll see these phenols all the time when there's a change in seasons because the leaves are changing. That's a phenol test. So anyways, we've got this litmus test. Shortcut developed by the Federal Circuit in subsequent cases. They've been using it for 40 years. That's prior art, prior practice. Patent claim is obvious only if there is some motivation or suggestion to combine prior art and teaching. Here's the pedal we know about. Here's the throttle we know about. Here are sensors we know about. Put the three together. Seems kind of obvious to me. So they use the TSM. That's supposed to prevent hindsight bias and favors the plaintiff. Then comes the Graham finding of fact. This establishes another framework, so-called objective framework, and that's section 103, or that's the subsection 103 of Code 35. Determination of the scope and content of the prior art, identification of differences between prior art and claimed art. Okay. Throttles are not new. Pedals are not new. Sensors are not new. But pedals for throttles with sensors, that's new. So now if somebody came up to me and said, oh, I've got, this new idea for doing control of outlets, I could say outlets are not new. Controlling outlets that go on and off is not new. But maybe doing the control of outlets that go on and off by using subcarrier modulation in the power line and sensing their actual power usage, maybe that's new. Or maybe it's not. I don't know. But putting those three things together, or those prior art elements together, might in effect make a contribution. And that's sufficient. So when I talk about what's new and what the contribution is, it must be very clear that you can identify those things which came before you and how you combine them in new ways, ways that may not have been motivated and suggested by prior art. In and of itself, the sensor doesn't suggest that it be used for a gas pedal. And gas pedals and throttles in and of themselves don't suggest in and of themselves that they be used with a sensor. And so that's the claim. And apparently there was finding of fact which allowed us to make it clear that the TSM test was a bar that was too low. So the Federal Circuit errs, or not, we don't know, in holding that claimed invention cannot be held obvious and thus unpatentable under Section 35 in the absence of proven teaching, suggestion, or motivation that would have led to a person of ordinary skill in the art to combine the relevant prior art teachings in the manner claimed. So why is this such an issue? Because if you have two tests, the TSM test and the Graham test, how do you know which one to apply? If TSM is too low a bar and the Graham test, the finding of fact, is a higher bar, then maybe the Graham test is the one we should be using. That seems to be what the Supreme Court is suggesting. So you can't apply just the TSM test as the only litmus test for obviousness. We spent so much time talking about what's obvious, but apparently not as much as these courts. Not nearly as enough. So now we have to sort of think in terms of how we can identify obviousness for ourselves in our research. Prior art with no suggestion of combination, no obvious motivation for combination, no suggestion that it be taught in this way. That's the TSM test, and we can certainly use that when we come up with a thesis idea, one that we think might be patentable. But suppose I said to you, I've got an idea for a fractal antenna for transmitting power. Okay, I can clearly identify the prior art, right? I've got fractal antennas, they're not new. I've got inductive power transmission, that's certainly not new. We call it wetricity, is that, somebody's calling it wetricity. I never heard of that before I met you. But I use this sort of thing. Now we've got this idea that fractal antennas and inductive coupling can be somehow combined in a novel way. I would say that is not directly suggested by teaching. And so when you say, inductive coupling for transmitting electricity and fractal antennas are not new, but putting these two ideas together, that's not obvious. Especially when you find out exactly how you can maximize power transfers for whatever frequency you settle on. Then that how business is directly patentable. And even if fractal antennas are covered by a patent that's still in force, and I think it is, back to 1996 is the most recent of them, so it's still in effect, you can still have an improvement patent. One that says, look, here's a way you can design fractal antennas to maximize power transfer in this frequency range. And now you've got a whole new claim and a different patent. And you can even seek to cross-license from the original patent holder who may have a basic method patent to the one that has a patent on power transfer. So I claim that from a TSM, right, that there's no obvious motivation for doing just power transfer. There's no obvious teaching in this area. There's no even obvious suggestion that this can be done. So now you've got something that effectively is TSM compliant in terms of obviousness. But what about the Graham method? Finding a fact. You ask 10 lay people whether or not they thought of this before, or whether it's in practice or had been suggested before. If all 10 of them say no, you're there. You found fact to support the non-obviousness. People of ordinary skill would not have not have predicted the variation that you may have come up with, because you designed it perhaps iteratively until it came up with a technique that it gave you a, I'll call it optimal power transfer. Let's see if we got one here. Water faucets and towel dispensers. They now have built-in sensors. Have you seen this? Hands-off faucets and hands-off towel dispensers. You wave your hand in front of it and the towel comes out, or you wave your hand in front of it and the water comes on. This is a health thing, right? Because people feel like if you touch something with bacteria on it, you may become contaminated. And so we don't want to touch dirty things. And presumably if you're at the faucet and you touch the handle, it's to wash your hands, so people who have touched it haven't washed their hands yet. So there's almost a compelling logic here that you don't want to touch that faucet handle because it's got stuff on it, whatever that stuff is. So let's consider this as almost a health-related invention. Is it predictable? Could we have predicted that sensors, which can sense motion, would have been combined with inventions like towel dispensers and water faucets? And the answer is maybe, but maybe not. Maybe it's not particularly obvious, so there's good patents there. And maybe the patents could be broad. The broadest of claims would be any device which allows the dispensing of the towel without touching the dispenser, right? And so then you could have had something like a preferred embodiment that works based on infrared, or interrupting constant exposure of light. How do these things work? Maybe it's capacitance. Maybe you could have several embodiments, and then a preferred one where you actually teach how to build it. So that's kind of where I wanted to go in terms of my review of obviousness. You know, we had talked about it before. I know we had brushed on these issues of obviousness, but I always wanted to somehow relate it back to your idea for your thesis. That is to say, yes, you're doing a review of prior work, but that review is going to help you form a foundation for a compelling acid test on why your stuff isn't obvious. So you'll be able to say, you know, we've had sound suppressors in prior art, right? They existed. Some of them work by shifting frequency, some of them work by muffler effects, some of them work by constructive and destructive interference, some are passive, some are active. And in the active mode, we've had a number of different inventions, but mine is different because, and I'm not sure what the part about the because is. Maybe it's because it has a feed-forward microphone and none of the other mufflers did. Maybe classic leaf blower muffler is little more than the kind of muffler you use on your mini bike. It's just a muffler designed for a small engine, and that's it. And nobody ever thinks about active mufflers for leaf blowers. Why, I don't know. There may be a reason for that. Maybe it's just hard. But there's something there, right, that's different than what you've seen in prior art. And presumably that makes it not obvious. Hopefully. Of course, we never really know what the patent office will say. In fact, based on the arguments between the courts, we don't even know what the courts will say, because the courts can't agree. So if the courts aren't going to agree, then for sure patent examiners won't agree, and neither will inventors. And that's one of those things. Law is complicated. So for today, we were going to do some presentations, and I think you all were going to hand in some paper printouts of your work. And what I wanted to do you want to save these changes? Yeah, sure. What I wanted to do was try and download some of the work and have you present it. So let me see if I can get your stuff. By now it should all have been uploaded. Is it warm in here again? Hot. Yeah, it got hot in here. This is sunny upstairs. That had a reason. Yes.
Oh, George texted me. He said that he was going to be late because he's done heart attack.
Because of what now?
He's done because he had a heart attack.
He had a what now?
Heart attack?
He's going to be late because he had a heart attack?
He's dad.
Huh?
His dad is in emergency room.
He's at the...
His dad.
Oh, his dad.
Yes.
Oh. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. That's terrible. Yeah, I was sort of wondering where he was. Alright, so let's stop this for now.